Nebraska Territory, 1887. While every homesteader raced to throw up square sod houses before winter, one immigrant was laying out something different, a perfect circle in the dirt. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Square walls were standard, 16 by 21 feet with corners you could measure fast. His round walls used the same 2-foot-thick sod bricks, but spiraled them in courses that never lined up, no corners to crack under pressure. He spent weeks extra on what others finished in days. Then January 12, 1888 arrived. The wind rose to 56 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to 36 degrees below zero within hours. Square soddies leaked at every seam. Water froze in wash basins 3 feet from the stove. Ice formed on inside walls. But that fool's roundhouse? The kettle still steamed. Water stayed liquid. No knife-edge drafts cutting through at ankle level. What did he understand about load paths, wind pressure, and thermal mass that everyone else missed? And how did his circular walls, built like an arch turned sideways, become the difference between freezing and surviving the worst blizzard in Nebraska history? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The morning of January 12, 1888, dawned clear across the Nebraska prairie, but experienced homesteaders knew better than to trust January skies. By 10 o'clock, the wind had begun its telltale shift from south to northwest, and within hours, it would rise to 56 miles per hour, while temperatures plummeted 36 degrees below zero. The Nebraska State Historical Society would later document this as the day the Great Blizzard settled every argument about how to build shelter on the treeless plains. 6 months earlier, when the immigrant had first laid out his circular foundation with a center stake and rope, those arguments had seemed purely theoretical. The prairie gave settlers grass and sky, but precious little lumber, so most had learned to cut the ground itself into building blocks. Standard practice called for sod bricks measuring 2 feet by 12 inches by 4 inches, cut from the dense root mat that held the plains together. A typical house measured 16 feet by 21 feet inside, with walls 2 feet thick and a roof structure of rafters spaced roughly 18 inches apart, topped with a willow layer, thin sod, and about 6 inches of dirt. The immigrant had studied this method carefully during his first Nebraska winter, watching neighbors patch their square soddies after every storm. He noticed how wind-driven snow found every seam between bricks, how flat walls seemed to bow outward under uneven loads, and how corners became collection points for ice and structural stress. Most troubling was the constant battle against infiltration, not just water, but air movement that carried precious heat away faster than any stove could replace it. When spring came, he began asking questions that others found odd. An old Swedish trapper explained how round granaries shed wind instead of catching it broadside. A Ponca woman, whose people had built earth lodges in this region for generations, laughed when she saw his square soddie and called it a cold house with corners for wind to grab. These conversations planted an idea that conventional homesteading wisdom dismissed. What if the problem wasn't just materials or thickness, but shape itself? By late summer of 1887, when most settlers were cutting sod for winter repairs, the immigrant was cutting sod for something entirely different. Instead of measuring out corners and straight lines, he drove a stake into the center of his chosen spot and attached an 18-foot rope. Walking the perimeter, he scored a perfect circle in the prairie grass, marking the outside edge of his walls. Neighbors gathering for the annual harvest work stopped to stare. Building a house like a grain bin out of dirt, called out Henrik Larsson, the settlement's most experienced sod house builder. Larsson had thrown up more square soddies than anyone in the township, and his method was proven. Stake the corners, stack the walls, frame the roof, move in fast. Round wastes space and wastes time. What happens when you want to add a room? The immigrant didn't argue. He simply pulled his measuring rope taut and began cutting the first course of sod bricks, using the same 2-foot by 12-inch by 4-inch dimensions everyone else used. But instead of stacking them in straight lines with corner joints, he laid them in a continuous spiral. each brick slightly overlapping the one below, so no vertical seam lined up with another. The technique borrowed from stone masonry. Joints that didn't align couldn't crack in straight lines. Other settlers gathered to watch what they increasingly saw as an expensive mistake. The circular layout meant custom cutting nearly every brick to maintain the curve. The spiral method required constant attention to keep courses level and radius consistent. Where a square house could be framed by eye and corner braced with simple arithmetic, the round walls demanded precise geometry at every step. Square is standard for a reason, Larson insisted, pointing to his own solid construction. Corners give you strength. Straight walls don't waste material. You can frame a square roof with lumber cut to standard lengths. The immigrant nodded respectfully but kept working. He had calculated the mathematics. An 18-foot inside diameter created roughly 57 feet of interior circumference, requiring about 28 to 30 bricks per course, depending on mortar gaps. With walls planned for 7 feet high, he would need nearly 800 sod bricks total. No more than a square house of similar interior space, just arranged in a different geometry. What his neighbors couldn't see was the engineering logic driving every decision. A circular wall functioned like an arch that never ended, keeping masonry in compression instead of tension. Flat walls wanted to bow outward under roof loads or wind pressure, especially at their weakest points, the corners where two walls met at right angles. Round walls pushed back evenly, distributing stress around the entire circumference. The load traveled like water in a pipe, finding no corners to concentrate force and crack the structure. As October turned to November and the first hard freezes arrived, the immigrants' round house began taking shape. 7 feet of carefully spiraled sod walls rose from the prairie, topped with a conventional rafter system but carrying more roof mass than standard practice recommended. Where most builders used 6 inches of dirt over their willow and sod layers, he doubled it to 12 inches, creating what amounted to a massive thermal battery above his living space. The extra mass was possible because circular walls carried distributed loads better than corner-braced squares. The additional thermal mass would prove crucial when fuel became scarce and outside temperatures turned deadly. But in late November, as neighbors made final preparations for winter, those advantages remained theoretical. The roundhouse still looked like an expensive experiment, and upcoming weather would test every assumption about frontier shelter. The circle wall had gone up slower than expected, but it had also gone up stronger than anyone anticipated. When the last course was laid and the roof completed, even Henrik Larson admitted grudgingly that the structure felt solid. The immigrants' response was characteristically practical. That's the whole point. By December, snow was already finding the weak spots in conventional construction, and experienced settlers knew the real test was still coming. The construction method that neighbors found so peculiar was rooted in principles the immigrant had learned working stone in the old country, adapted now to prairie sod and frontier conditions. Where conventional sod house builders cut their bricks and stacked them like lumber, course upon course with joints aligned, he treated each sod brick as part of a continuous masonry system that had to distribute weight and resist lateral forces without benefit of corner bracing. His breaking plow turned long ribbons of prairie sod, the dense root mat peeling away in strips that could be cut to precise dimensions. Each brick measured exactly 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick, but unlike his neighbors who cut bricks as needed and stacked them quickly, the immigrant cut his entire first course before laying a single piece. The center stake and 18-foot rope became his constant tools, checking radius and maintaining the perfect circle that would determine structural integrity for the entire wall system. The spiral laying method required patience that most homesteaders couldn't afford, but it solved a fundamental problem that prairie builders routinely faced. Straight stacked courses created continuous vertical joints, weak planes where cracks could run from foundation to roofline under stress. The immigrant's spiral pattern meant no joint aligned with another, creating what masons called a running bond that distributed loads across multiple bricks instead of concentrating stress at single points. Each course required 28 to 30 bricks, depending on the gaps he maintained for settling, and he laid them with the grass side down to take advantage of the root system's natural binding strength. The thick prairie roots, still alive when cut, would continue holding soil particles together as they dried and compressed under the weight of successive courses. This was knowledge borrowed directly from documented sod house practice, but applied with the precision of someone who understood that circular walls had different structural requirements than conventional rectangles. Henrik Larsson stopped by regularly to observe what he still considered an interesting mistake. "You're making this too complicated," he said, watching the immigrant check his radius measurement for the dozenth time that morning. "A square wall goes up straight and stays up straight. You can see if it's plumb just by looking. How do you even know if a round wall is right?" The immigrant demonstrated by stretching his rope from center stake to wall and walking the perimeter, checking that every point measured exactly 18 feet. "A circle doesn't lie," he said. "Either the radius is consistent or it isn't. Either the curve is true or it's broken. With corners, you can have one wall plumb and square while the whole structure twists out of true." What Larsson couldn't see was the way circular geometry solved the prairie's most persistent building challenges. Wind pressure against a flat wall created maximum stress at the center of long spans and multiplied that stress at corners where walls met at right angles. A curved wall presented no flat surface for wind to push against. Air pressure flowed around the circumference instead of hammering against resistant planes. The continuous curve meant no corners to concentrate stress and start structural failures. The physics worked like an arch turned sideways and closed into a complete ring. Every point on the wall pushed equally against every other point, keeping the masonry in compression where sod and earth materials performed best. Adobe builders in the Southwest had understood this principle for centuries, but Plains homesteaders, trained in timber frame construction, typically thought in terms of posts, beams, and corner bracing rather than continuous compression rings. The immigrant had learned these lessons from sources his neighbors dismissed as irrelevant. The Ponca woman who had laughed at his original square soddie belonged to a people who had built earth lodges throughout this region for generations before European settlement. Her ancestors used earth and timber not as desperate substitutes for real building materials, but as engineered systems designed specifically for prairie conditions. Earth lodges were round for the same reason grain silos were round. The shape handled both internal loads and external pressures more efficiently than rectangular alternatives. The Swedish trapper had shared similar knowledge from a different tradition. Scandinavian builders had centuries of experience with turf construction in climates where timber was scarce and thermal efficiency mattered more than speed. Round turf buildings appeared throughout Northern European folk architecture, not as primitive shelters but as sophisticated responses to specific environmental challenges. By mid-December, the immigrants' wall stood 7 feet high and solid as any masonry work on the frontier. The final courses had required careful planning to maintain structural integrity while preparing for the roof system. Unlike square walls that could simply be topped with a plate beam, circular walls needed the roof load distributed evenly around the entire circumference. He solved this by creating a continuous ring beam from the last course of sod bricks, laid horizontally to spread rafter loads across the full wall structure. The roof framing followed conventional frontier practice. Rafters spaced roughly 18 inches on center, topped with willow branches, then a layer of thin sod, and finally the crucial dirt covering. But where most builders used 6 inches of earth to seal their roofs, the immigrant doubled that thickness to 12 inches. The additional mass was possible because his circular walls could carry heavier loads without the stress concentrations that plagued corner-supported rectangles. The extra roof mass served multiple functions that would prove critical when severe weather tested the structure. 12 inches of earth provided thermal mass that would moderate interior temperature swings, absorbing heat from fires during active burning and releasing it slowly when flames died down. The additional weight also pressed more firmly against the roof structure, reducing air infiltration that robbed heated air from interior spaces. Neighbors who had initially mocked the project began commenting differently as the structure neared completion. The round walls rose smooth and solid, without the telltale bulges and irregularities that often appeared in hasty sod construction. The building looked permanent in a way that many frontier structures did not, less like emergency shelter and more like intentional architecture designed to last multiple seasons. "It's solid," admitted Larson, running his hand along the curved wall during a December visit. The immigrant's response was characteristically understated. That's the whole point. But solid was only part of the advantage his method would provide. The real test would come when prairie winter turned deadly and thermal efficiency became the difference between survival and catastrophe. The first serious test came not with the legendary blizzard of January 12th, but during the routine brutality of a normal plains winter. By late December, temperatures had dropped below zero for 6 consecutive nights, and the wind carried the kind of persistent bite that found every weakness in frontier construction. Across the settlement, square soddies began displaying the familiar signs of thermal failure that experienced homesteaders had learned to expect and endure. In Henrik Larsson's well-built rectangular house, the morning ritual involved scraping ice from the water bucket that sat just 4 feet from the stove. The northwest corner, where 2 walls met at a right angle, had developed a persistent cold spot where breath vapor condensed and froze against the interior sod. During the worst cold snaps, Larsson's wife hung a quilt across that corner to create a smaller heated space, abandoning a quarter of their interior to the killing cold outside. The Erickson family, whose 16 by 21-foot soddie represented typical frontier construction, had mapped their house's thermal geography through bitter experience. The area within 5 feet of the stove remained livable with steady firing. Beyond that radius, water left overnight would skim with ice, and family members slept fully clothed under multiple blankets. The children had learned to dress near the stove each morning, then dash to the cold zones, only when necessary. These weren't failures of craftsmanship or laziness. They represented the inherent limitations of rectangular sod construction when pushed against plains winter extremes. Flat walls spanning 16 to 20 feet between corners created thermal bridges where heat transferred directly from interior to exterior through the 2-foot-thick sod. Corner joints, despite careful construction, remained weak points where cold air infiltrated and warm air escaped. The mathematics of heat loss worked against every square soddie. Large surface areas relative to interior volume and corner geometries that concentrated thermal stress at structural joints. Meanwhile, the immigrant's round house was quietly demonstrating different thermal behavior that neighbors began noticing during brief visits. Martha Erickson, delivering borrowed supplies during a particularly bitter cold snap, stepped inside and immediately noticed the absence of the knife-edge drafts that plagued rectangular construction. The air wasn't dramatically warmer, but it was calm. No ankle-level currents of cold air racing along walls, no sharp temperature gradients that made parts of the room uninhabitable. The difference wasn't mystical but mathematical. The circular wall eliminated corners where cold air could pool and create convection currents. The continuous curve also minimized the surface area exposed to exterior conditions. A circle enclosed more interior volume with less wall surface than any rectangular shape of equivalent size. This meant less thermal bridging and fewer linear feet of exterior wall to lose heat through. More significantly, the 12-inch roof mass was functioning as a massive thermal battery that moderated temperature swings. During active firing, the thick earth layer absorbed excess heat that would otherwise escape through conventional 6-inch roofs. When the fire died to coals, that stored thermal mass continued radiating warmth downward, maintaining interior temperatures longer than thin-roofed structures could manage. The immigrant had also positioned his heating system differently than conventional practice. Instead of placing the fireplace against an exterior wall where heat could transfer directly outside, he built his hearth toward the center of the circular space. This arrangement meant radiant heat traveled shorter distances to reach all interior areas, and the thermal mass of the central fireplace added to the structure's overall heat storage capacity. By early January, these thermal advantages had become impossible to ignore during neighborhood visits. When the Larssons stopped by to borrow tools, Henrik noticed that a bucket of water left near the door, typically the coldest spot in any sod house, remained liquid through a night that dropped exterior temperatures to 15 degrees below zero. His own identical bucket, positioned the same distance from a comparable stove, had frozen solid. The round house's thermal efficiency was allowing the immigrant to maintain comfortable conditions while burning significantly less fuel than his neighbors. Where rectangular soddies required constant feeding with prairie grass, dried buffalo chips, or precious imported coal, the circular structure retained heat so effectively that moderate firing kept interior temperatures stable. This wasn't just comfort, it was survival economics. Fuel scarcity killed plain settlers as surely as cold, and any method that stretched limited heating resources could mean the difference between making it through winter and freezing before spring. Local skepticism was shifting as practical results accumulated. "I'll admit it holds heat better," conceded Larson during a January visit. "But we'll see how it handles a real storm. When the wind gets behind weather, that's when you learn if your building's really solid." The immigrant nodded acknowledgement but didn't argue. He'd built his structure using principles tested by centuries of Northern European turf construction and Plains Indian earth lodge engineering. The real validation would come when extreme weather pushed every building system to its breaking point. That validation was approaching. Weather-wise homesteaders could read the signs in wind patterns, animal behavior, and the particular quality of winter light that preceded major storms. The immigrant had spent evenings checking his fuel supply, testing door and window seals, and ensuring his flue system would handle the extreme drafts that accompanied severe weather. His neighbors were making similar preparations, but they would face the coming crisis with rectangular structures that had already shown thermal weaknesses during routine cold. The circular house had yet to meet conditions that would truly test its engineering advantages. The morning of January 12th dawned deceptively clear, but by 10 o'clock the wind had begun its ominous shift from south to northwest. Within hours, conditions would deteriorate beyond anything the settlement had experienced, and the fundamental differences between circular and rectangular thermal engineering would become matters of life and death rather than mere construction philosophy. The wind reached 56 miles per hour by noon on January 12th, and the temperature began its catastrophic plunge from morning's deceptive calm to 36 degrees below zero by nightfall. What the Nebraska State Historical Society would later document as the most severe blizzard in territorial history struck with a speed that caught even experienced plainsmen unprepared. Snow didn't fall, it drove horizontally in sheets that turned familiar landmarks invisible and transformed the short distance between house and barn into potentially fatal journeys. Henrik Larsson's square soddie, built with careful attention to standard frontier practice, began failing within the first hour of the storm's full fury. Wind-driven snow found the mortar joints between sod bricks, particularly along the northwest wall where the rectangular structure presented a flat surface directly to the storm's assault. The snow packed into these gaps. Then began the deadly cycle that destroyed so many plains dwellings. Interior heat melted the packed snow, creating water that soaked into the sod, then refroze as temperatures plummeted, expanding and wedging the joints wider for the next wave of infiltration. More immediately dangerous, the door on Larsson's windward side drifted shut within 2 hours, blocked by snow that the flat wall couldn't shed. The rectangular geometry that neighbors had praised for its simplicity now worked against survival. The 90-degree corners created eddies where snow collected and compacted, while the long flat walls caught the full force of horizontal wind pressure. By evening, the northwest wall was visibly bowing inward, under the uneven load of accumulated drift and wind pressure concentrated at the wall's center span. The Erickson family's soddie suffered similar structural punishment, but their crisis was thermal rather than mechanical. Their 16 by 21-foot interior, which had seemed spacious during construction, now proved to be a liability as the family retreated to an ever smaller circle around their failing heat source. The corner where cold habitually collected became uninhabitable within hours of the storm's arrival. Ice formed on the interior walls despite their desperate efforts to maintain fire, and breath vapor condensed and froze on any surface more than 6 feet from the stove. By 10 o'clock that night, with exterior conditions at their most lethal, both families faced the brutal arithmetic of survival. Their fuel supplies, calculated for normal winter consumption, were burning at rates that would exhaust reserves before the storm passed. The rectangular structure's poor thermal efficiency, manageable during routine cold, became deadly when extreme conditions demanded maximum heat retention with minimum fuel expenditure. The immigrant's round house was experiencing the same meteorological assault, but responding with fundamentally different structural and thermal behavior. Wind striking the curved wall found no flat surface to push against and no corners to create destructive pressure concentrations. Instead of fighting the storm's force, the circular shape diverted wind around its circumference, creating what meteorologists would later recognize as streamlined flow that minimized structural stress and prevented the snow accumulation that was burying rectangular buildings. Inside, the thermal advantages that had seemed merely comfortable during normal winter were now proving critical for survival. The 12 inches of roof mass that neighbors had criticized as excessive was functioning as designed, absorbing and storing heat during active firing, then radiating that stored energy downward when fuel conservation demanded banking the fire to coals. The central fireplace position meant radiant heat reached every point in the circular interior within 8 feet, while the absence of cold collecting corners prevented the thermal dead zones that were forcing rectangular families into progressively smaller living spaces. Most significantly, the roundhouse's superior thermal efficiency allowed the immigrant to maintain life-sustaining interior temperatures while consuming roughly half the fuel his neighbors were burning in their losing battle against infiltration and heat loss. This wasn't just comfort, it was survival mathematics that would determine who lived through the storm and who froze when their fuel ran out. Near midnight, when the blizzard reached its full intensity, desperate neighbors began arriving at the roundhouse door. The Larson family appeared first, half frozen and struggling through drifts that had made their own door inaccessible. Henrik carried his youngest daughter while his wife and older children stumbled behind, following the sound of his voice through whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible beyond arm's length. The immigrant opened his door to a blast of wind-driven snow, but no structural crisis. The curved walls had shed accumulation instead of collecting it, and the door remained functional because circular geometry created no corners for drifting. "Boots by the wall," he directed calmly. "Don't crowd the stove. We'll rotate positions so everyone gets warm." Within an hour, the Erickson family had also abandoned their failing soddie, carrying their infant and what warm clothing they could grab during a brief lull in the storm's fury. The roundhouse now sheltered 9 people, 2 full families plus the immigrant, in a space that would have been overcrowded under normal conditions, but proved adequate because the structure's thermal efficiency maintained livable temperatures throughout the interior circle. The immigrant managed heating with the discipline that extreme conditions demanded. Small, steady fires rather than roaring blazes that consumed precious fuel without providing additional warmth retention. Careful attention to the flue to prevent heat loss while maintaining enough draft to keep deadly carbon monoxide from accumulating in the sealed interior. Strategic use of the thermal mass, allowing the earth roof to absorb excess heat during active burning, then banking the fire to let stored heat carry them through fuel conservation periods. Through the longest night of the settlement's existence, the roundhouse proved its engineering advantages under conditions that destroyed conventional construction. While rectangular soddies across the plains succumbed to structural failure, thermal collapse, or fuel exhaustion, the circular building maintained interior temperatures above freezing with steady but not excessive fuel consumption. The immigrant didn't celebrate or lecture. He simply managed resources and space to keep 9 people alive until morning brought assessment of what the storm had cost and what it had proven. Dawn revealed the storm's verdict written across the settlement landscape in failed structures, exhausted fuel supplies, and families who owed their survival to construction principles that neighbors had dismissed as wasteful and primitive just months before. The morning of January 13th revealed devastation that would reshape how plains settlers thought about winter construction. Henrik Larsson's carefully built square soddie had suffered structural damage that made it uninhabitable. The northwest wall bowed inward by nearly 6 inches, with mortar joints split wide enough to admit killing drafts. The door remained buried under 4 feet of drift that had packed solid against the flat wall, and ice coated the interior surfaces where melted infiltration had refrozen during the night's temperature extremes. The Erickson family found their rectangular house in similar condition, but their crisis extended beyond structural damage to fuel exhaustion. Their desperate attempts to heat the 16 by 21-foot interior during the storm had consumed their entire remaining winter coal supply, plus 2 weeks' worth of prairie grass reserves. Even if they could repair the building, they lacked heating resources to survive until spring supply deliveries became possible. Across the settlement, the pattern repeated with deadly consistency. Square soddies that had seemed adequate during normal winter conditions proved vulnerable to the combined assault of extreme wind pressure, snow infiltration, and thermal demands that exceeded their fundamental design limitations. The rectangular geometry that pioneers had adopted for its familiarity and construction speed created systematic weaknesses that extreme weather exploited without mercy. The immigrants' round house had emerged from the identical meteorological assault essentially undamaged. The curved walls showed no structural stress, the door remained functional, and interior conditions stayed livable throughout the crisis with moderate fuel consumption. More significantly, the building had successfully sheltered 9 people, triple its normal occupancy, while maintaining thermal efficiency that rectangular structures couldn't match even when housing single families. Word of the round house's performance spread through the settlement with the speed that survival information always traveled on the frontier. Within days of the storm, neighbors who had mocked circular construction were asking detailed questions about wall geometry, roof mass, and thermal management. The conversation had shifted from skepticism about the immigrants' methods to urgent interest in principles that might prevent future catastrophe. Henrik Larsson, whose expertise in conventional sod construction had made him the settlement's unofficial building authority, approached the immigrant with questions that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. That wall thickness, keeping it at 2 feet all the way around the circle, how do you calculate the materials for that much curve? The immigrant walked him through the mathematics. 18 feet inside diameter created roughly 57 feet of circumference, requiring approximately 800 sod bricks for 7-foot walls. But the circular geometry distributed structural loads more efficiently than corner-braced rectangles. More importantly, Larsson wanted to understand the thermal principles that had allowed the round house to maintain heat with half the fuel consumption of rectangular buildings. The immigrant explained the physics in practical terms. Circular walls enclosed maximum interior volume with minimum exterior surface area, reducing heat loss through thermal bridging. The absence of corners eliminated cold air collection points and convection currents that plagued rectangular construction. The 12-inch roof mass provided thermal storage that moderated temperature swings and extended heating efficiency between firings. By February, 3 families were planning modifications that borrowed circular principles without completely abandoning rectangular layouts. The Ericksons decided to rebuild with rounded corners and a curved windward wall, reducing wind pressure concentrations while maintaining familiar interior geometry. The Andersons planned to double their roof mass from 6 inches to 12 inches, creating thermal storage capacity that would stretch their limited fuel supplies. Most significantly, the newcomer families arriving for spring settlement were requesting information about round construction before breaking ground. The immigrant found himself consulted not as an eccentric experimenter, but as a source of proven building knowledge adapted to plains conditions. His fusion of Scandinavian turf building techniques with indigenous earth lodge principles had created a construction method that newcomers recognized as sophisticated engineering rather than primitive shelter. The broader implications extended beyond individual building choices to fundamental questions about frontier adaptation and traditional knowledge. The roundhouse's success validated approaches that European-trained builders had initially dismissed as backward or impractical. Plains Indian earth lodge construction, which incorporated circular geometry and earth mass for thermal efficiency, was increasingly recognized as advanced environmental engineering rather than primitive expedient. The immigrant's method also demonstrated how immigrant knowledge could enhance frontier survival when combined respectfully with indigenous expertise. His Scandinavian understanding of turf construction merged with Plains Indian earth lodge principles to create building techniques superior to either tradition alone. This synthesis represented the kind of cultural knowledge exchange that enabled frontier communities to thrive in environments that defeated purely European approaches. By the spring of 1888, photographic documentation was capturing rounded sod structures as a recognized category of plains architecture. The Washington State University Special Collections would later preserve images showing various implementations of circular building principles, not as curiosities, but as examples of environmental adaptation that solved specific regional challenges. The settlement's building practices had evolved from uniformly rectangular construction to a diverse approach that incorporated circular geometry, increased roof mass, and strategic positioning based on wind patterns and thermal efficiency. The immigrant's round house remained the most complete expression of these principles, but his techniques had spread through the community as adopted knowledge rather than copied novelty. Thasa, Dapretu. In Novelty, the deeper lesson resonated beyond constructions about expertise and adaptation. The plains environment had tested conventional frontier wisdom and found it wanting, while methods dismissed as wasteful or primitive had proven superior under crisis conditions. The settlement learned that survival often depended on recognizing traditional knowledge that appeared unconventional only because it solved problems that conventional approaches had never successfully addressed. On the treeless plains, building for survival meant building with forces that couldn't be voted against or argued away. Wind, cold, and thermal physics operated by laws that didn't care about construction traditions or cultural preferences. The roundhouse succeeded because it worked with those forces instead of fighting them, using geometry and mass to create shelter that protected human life when weather turned deadly and conventional methods failed.